Good morning again, and thank you for attending the Division of Mental Health and Addictions 2021 Practice Policy and Innovation in Mental Health and Addictions Providers, Mental Health and Addictions. We are joined this morning with Dr. Dennis Rudnick, Assistant Professor of Multicultural Education for the Missouri State University. Dr. Rudnick is going to be exploring with us today what is explicit bias. As mental health and addictions professionals committed to cultural consciousness, we may be engaged in various efforts to understand the significance and meaning of implicit bias, our subconscious attitudes and beliefs towards a person or group. What, however, if our biases are explicit when we are conscious or aware of our attitudes and beliefs towards a person or group? How do our explicit biases shape our interactions with clients and colleagues? How do they inform our personal and professional knowledge, skill, and will? Dr. Rudnick's upcoming session will help us to recognize, respond, and redress our explicit biases as they impact our roles as mental health and addiction professionals. I'd like to just welcome sincerely my good friend and colleague, Dr. Dennis Rudnick. Dr. Rudnick is an assistant professor of multicultural education at Missouri State University. He previously was the associate director of multicultural education and research, as well as affiliate faculty in the School of Education and University College at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. The state of Indiana misses you, Dr. Rudnick, and we are glad that you are still ongoing in supporting us in this wonderful work of cultural competency, even though you now reside in Missouri. Dr. Rudnick has more than 25 years of professional experience as an educator, consultant, researcher, administrator, facilitator, program developer, and public speaker on multicultural civil rights and social justice issues. His research includes the relationships between racism, identity, ideology, knowledge construction, and social movements. Specifically, he focuses on colorblind ideology and whiteness and their impacts on white anti-racist teacher identity development. Dr. Rudnick is committed to fostering a climate of transformative awareness and understanding through education. He holds a BA in sociology from the University of Mary Washington and a Ph.D. and Master's in Education in Curriculum and Instruction, Multicultural Education from the University of Washington, Seattle. Dr. Rudnick, thank you again for one more time providing us the conference primer in setting the stage for our theme and overall conference learnings and objectives this year. I transition it to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Sunny and Liz and the entire team, and all of you for being present here today. You know, we were talking before, I think a number of folks came in the room about how if you go to Sunny's house, you will be fed. And so it's like another reason why I am missing in Indiana just a little bit these days. So I'm going to hold her accountable. So there'll be a theme here of accountability. So I'm going to hold Sunny accountable the next time we are in Indiana. So I will eat. I also want to name too, if we're talking about accountability and humility. So Sunny mentioned is integral to my work. It's looking at colorblind ideology. One of the things that I have become aware of, and now I'm explicitly aware of, is, you know, how the term colorblindness, although it's addressed in a problematic way in which we tend to deal with identity, particularly around race or other physical iterations, is that it's quite ableist, right? And so it's assuming that one is blind. And so even though it doesn't, you don't mean anything by it, and so there's been a lot of language out there about race evasive or color evasive. And so I just wanted to take the opportunity to think about this. Isn't about being so woke that you've arrived, right? We know that the work is not about that. And I think Dr. Merritt certainly had this at the heart of what she talked about today. This is a lifelong journey, a lifelong process. I also, before I share my screen, I love this artwork in so many ways. I think it's quite powerful. It's a reminder that young folks know a bit more of what's going on than we might often be led to believe. It's also a reminder that there's a lot, if we look at some of these pieces in here, we may, for better and for worse, have an explicit bias for some of these things, right? You know, much of the harder work can be around implicit bias because we don't necessarily know what we don't know, even though it can shape our attitudes, our beliefs, our dispositions, our behaviors. But I wonder when you first saw or when you're seeing it now, if there's a word or a phrase or a concept, maybe it's Trump Pence, maybe it's coronavirus, maybe it's Tiger King and Carol Baskin, right? That's implied in there. Some of you, I don't know what that is, but I'm assuming a number of folks do. That we have an explicit recognition and reckoning with that we feel some kind of way about that, this particular thing. And it's important for us to account for when we do those things, right? So I just wanted to name that and also honor what is some really beautiful artwork. And then we're going to transition. So we're going to talk a lot about explicit bias. I want to foreground this a little bit by just naming some things. If you are here today, and I recognize some of you are here voluntarily by your own volition. Some of you may have been voluntold to be here. Some of you may have come kicking and screaming, and yet here all we are. We are all coming at this work from different spaces and places, but your presence here today, and certainly for those of us that have engaged with the work that DMHA and TechServe has done for the last few years, or any ways in which you have attempted to do this work as an express reflection of your commitment to cultural consciousness, that you are engaged with yourself, doing that intrapersonal work, the interpersonal work of engaging with others, and engaging with systems, often all at the same time. And it's also important to name, honor, and respect that we are all reckoning with hard questions and sometimes even harder answers. We might be able to diagnose a problem and we can see something for what it is, but what do we actually do about that? And so hopefully that your time here today and tomorrow with the conference will provide you some more questions as well as some more answers. So what we're going to do here briefly today is we're going to define bias, right? I want to situate explicit bias as opposed to implicit bias. We're going to spend some time on reflection and context. So some reflection questions regarding explicit bias that you may, you will have an opportunity to sit with as mental health and addiction providers, professionals, and then thinking more broadly about implications and impact for a profession and society. They're going to kind of close with some overviews, and perhaps strategy is not the right word. One of the pieces that we'll look at briefly is something that I'm adapting for our purposes from the field of education, the work of Paul Gorski on equity literacy, because I think there's some good language in there that might help us map some next steps out. Thank you for spending some time with me today. And then there'll be some questions at the end. So bias, in a general sense, biases are tendencies, preferences, or inclinations, especially ones that inhibit our impartial judgment. They are often the product of our socialization experiences, not our moral, ethical, or logical frameworks. You can be a very smart person, a very decent, good, kind person, and still hold bias. And bias isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. Those of you who have been in a workshop with me before or have done some work around bias, implicit or otherwise, know that it's got nothing to do with your goodness or your decency or your intelligence. It's more complex than that. And it's important to know that we all have biases, right? Some of our biases are implicit and some of them are explicit. And we often, and rightly so, focus on implicit bias. So what we're going to do today is kind of think about what does it mean when we hold explicit biases? What does it mean for our field, for our organization, for our constituents, our clients? So one way to distinguish the two, right? So when something is implicit, it is often unconscious, it is often spontaneous, right? It becomes habit, right? And so we don't think about it, right? You might see someone walking down the street and you've got an implicit bias against an identity that person holds or identities that person holds, and you grab your wallet or your purse a little differently, right? There's a lot of work, hopefully, and I would encourage you all to take the IAT, the implicit association test. There's something called response latency. In our profession as mental health and addiction providers, and certainly in the field of medicine and healthcare, and this also extends itself to other fields, including education, law, implicit bias is highly correlated with ambivalence, right? Ambivalence about client-patient concerns, poorer prognoses, right? We're not spending as much time, effort, or energy, decreased pity, all right? So we're not even getting to empathy. There's a decrease in terms of our base sympathy. We also have, there's also what's not listed here is ideas that certain bodies may be more resistant to pain, for example. Increased anger, right? And there's an unwillingness to assist, right? With explicit bias, there is a level of consciousness. We are conscious, we are aware of our biases. There is a deliberative process, right? Someone comes in the room, someone enters your space or sends an email or makes a phone call, and there are some decisions that you are making in that moment. Now here, it is often reflective of our social and our personal values, for better and for worse. With explicit bias, there is a high degree of self-reporting, right? Folks will often name it or own it, or oftentimes they do. And explicit bias is often correlated with a drawing of group boundaries, right? Us and them, me and you. And not just the drawing of the group boundaries, but the recognition of difference. But even though we're different, I'm not going to deal with you, right? I have a son who's 7 years old. We're a different age. I can make that distinction. I'm not cutting him out, right? With explicit bias, that can happen in many ways. Explicit bias is also correlated with overt discrimination and often hostility. Okay. The work of Dr. DeVidio is someone that I would point to. He's done a lot of work around bias as it pertains to race, ethnicity, body size, sexuality, gender identity, gender expression. And this is just a nice way to think about some of the distinctions, right? How they relate. So with implicit bias, it's more spontaneous. It might be reflexive, unaware. It might be uncontrollable, or it might be subtle. And there's a lot of work. Many of you have perhaps gone through the work of how do you uncover and reconcile and counter some of your implicit biases. The challenge and the possibility with explicit biases is that the synergy of our attitudes and behaviors, we have had a chance to be reflective. Right? They may be overt. And whether or not one agrees that they should or that they will engage ways to get rid of their explicit biases, the fact that they are observable, controllable, monitorable, right, lends itself well to other folks in the room, perhaps your colleagues, perhaps your supervisors, right? Perhaps you in whatever role you're in, to name those things for what they are, and determine whether or not you want those sorts of biases, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors to reflect your organization. Okay? So, few things. People are more likely to express explicit biases when they perceive an individual or group to be a threat to their well-being. Perception is an important word, right? Perception is reality for some folks. This is true when folks have historically had experiences with people that hold an identity, with an identity perhaps that looks like you. As a white man who's also cisgender and heterosexual doing the work of multicultural education in a lot of different ways, I have to be mindful of that. No matter how much I know and what kind of person I am, there are folks that have fit my description that still and have in the past, with good intentions, done some bad stuff. So, so if folks are even perceived that another individual or group is a threat to their well-being, the drawing of group boundaries is more likely to occur, okay? When people perceive their biases to be valid, they're more likely to justify unfair treatment or even violence. Research has shown, for example, that white people are more likely to express anti-Muslim prejudice when they perceive national security to be at risk, and express more negative attitudes towards Asian Americans when they perceive an economic threat. Right? This is true large and small. If we have certain ideas about, say, African Americans, right? Those may render themselves explicit when we start to rationalize that the reason that you don't want folks to move into your neighborhood is really because of property values. What kind of honest conversation are you having with yourself? Or if somebody from a different ethnic or racial group wants to date your child, right? What rationales are you using? This unfair treatment, this disproportionate systemic treatment, and we have to remind ourselves, and as Dr. Merritt addressed this morning, that this isn't just a case-by-case issue. We have to engage this work systemically, right? We have to look at patterns because those patterns matter. This unfair treatment can have long-term negative impacts on victims' physical and mental health, right? So even if things are not your fault or directly responsible, right? It's a good reminder that oftentimes the clients and our colleagues and ourselves are navigating a world they're doing some things to us, right? And sometimes these can predispose us to seek out various forms of coping mechanisms, and certainly can harm our mental and emotional health. This last year is a good reminder of that. And it's also a good reminder of the ways in which they can disproportionately impact certain communities based upon certain identities. Individuals who admit to conscious biases are very clear, generally speaking, about their beliefs, feelings, and attitudes toward others. Right? This is in part where the challenge and possibilities lie. Their associated behaviors are intentional and often openly demonstrative of such sentiments. I don't like these people, right? And maybe they'll say, like, well, maybe I'll tolerate you based upon your quote unquote preference or lifestyle, for example, as we might often hear from folks in the LGBTQ plus community. Right? So then maybe there's a rationale in there, but folks aren't hiding behind what they believe, what they feel, what their attitudes are, and certainly how that might rationalize or justify or excuse their resulting behaviors. I don't want to work with that patient. Right? And sometimes these things aren't set out in the open. Sometimes they can be explicit in the backstage, right? When we're talking with other folks that we may perceive to hold similar views. So I'm gonna use this time to ask you all some questions, and I've adapted this from another module, and I specifically adapted this next set of reflection questions to think about explicit bias. So I hope that as you engage with these questions, that you will think about it through that lens. I do want to name that none of this is intended to make you feel any way except how you feel, right? The purpose is not to induce guilt or blame or shame, although some of that might come up. It may not, but it might. So this is an opportunity to remind ourselves that those feelings might come and that this is not the purpose, this is not the intention, even though that may be the outcome. The purpose is that we can think about where we're at, perhaps think about where our field is at, and are we willing to do better? And what might we actually do? Why any of this actually matters. Okay, here we go. As you contemplate each of these questions, I'd like for you to consider factors such as age, race, literacy, language, accent, faith, gender identity, gender expression, socioeconomic status, sexuality, citizenship, body size, right? This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the social identities that often shape how we make sense of the world and how the world makes sense of us, embedded in our policies, our practices, our ideas, our norms. I'd imagine that some of us may still feel uncomfortable with some of these categories even being brought about, right? That can be part of our socialization experiences. And if that is an implicit consideration for us, it's important to unearth that. And if it is an explicit consideration for us, right? If we take issue with, say, language, right? People come here that need to learn the language kind of framework, right? It's important that you own that you name that. Okay, so the goal here is authenticity. We're contemplating, we're reflecting for authenticity. So first question, and I'll ask each question and give you all just a few moments, all right, to engage with yourself around that. Do my explicit biases impact the amount of time I spend with my patients? Second question, do my explicit biases influence how I communicate with patients and their families? Again, I don't know if I am a professor, but I am not Professor X, so I cannot read your minds right now. So this is an opportunity for you to be honest. Right? No one can get inside your head but you. If you want to write things down, that's fine. If you just, all I ask is that wherever you stand, whatever your attitudes, beliefs, dispositions, behaviors happen to be, is that you take this opportunity to be honest. Okay. Next question. Do my explicit biases hamper my capacity to feel and express empathy toward my patients? And to be clear with all of these questions, it may not be true in every case with respect to the identities that were mentioned a few slides ago, but perhaps it's present for some of those categories and particular iterations of those. Yeah. To use the language example, right? Is it someone speaking Spanish? Or is it someone that is perceived to be Latinx or Hispanic or Chicano that is speaking Spanish? Would the explicit biases be there if it were, say, me speaking Spanish? Okay. Perhaps we're fine with certain faiths that are not our own, but not others. How does this impact my capacity to feel and express empathy toward my patients? Not sympathy, mind you, but empathy. Do my explicit biases affect the types of treatment and medications I recommend? If any of these questions began with should as opposed to do, they would be different questions, right? So the questions here are do they, right? So some of this conundrum between the ideal and the real that we often need to reckon with. And we may even be explicitly understanding of what that means, and maybe we don't, maybe we're not, but it's an important consideration. Do my explicit biases interfere with my capacity to interact positively with my patients and their families? I'm providing the same identities here just as a reminder. Do you ever perceive, explicitly perceive, that you are less comfortable with patients who you may know to be different due to age, race, literacy, language, accent, faith, gender identity, gender expression, socioeconomic status, sexuality, citizenship, body size? Right? And again, some folks may not hold identities, but we may perceive them to be, right, holding these identities. Right? Sometimes it's in person, sometimes it's over the phone, sometimes it's via email, sometimes it's the recognition of a name that you can't pronounce or not familiar with. Are we aware, are we cognizant of this level of discomfort with these patients? Do we rationalize it, explicitly rationalize it by saying, well, I'm in a helping service profession, so it's okay. I'm a good person. I'm overworked, I'm underpaid, and so forth. Do we do that? Do we reckon with any of this? Do you know whether or believe that your colleagues and other staff with whom you routinely work think that your attitudes and behaviors demonstrate explicit bias? Here's one of those real rubs. We may be willing to reconcile with ourselves some of that intrapersonal work. And we recognize that it's not about guilt, blame, or shame, but holding ourselves accountable, responsible. It's another entirely when we have to engage with others, people that we love, we know, we trust, or just have to work with. Sometimes there's power distancing, right? If your supervisor or a senior team member says something, enacts something, behaves in particular ways, are you open to discussing these issues with them? Not to prove them wrong, right? Because there's limitations to certain approaches, right? Are we listening to speak or listening to understand, right? So do you know whether or believe that your colleagues and other staff with whom you routinely work with think that your attitudes and behaviors demonstrate explicit bias? What do folks think about you? I'm sorry, my dog's barking in the background. She is explicitly biased towards the UPS driver. If so, are you open to discussing these issues with them to elicit their point of view? Have patients or their families directly or through satisfaction surveys raise concern about your attitude or the way you communicate with them? I just received my course evaluations for the semester, literally moments before we started today. And I work really hard, right? I was sharing with Sunny beforehand that I put a lot of extra time, and this year has been challenging for my students and for me too, certainly in an online space with everything happening in the world. I'm exhausted right now. And so there's a part of me, I see some student feedback or student comments in a particular way that I'm going to respond in a certain kind of way, right? And I can own that and I can name that, and I might be somewhat justified. And yet, do I have things that are not just areas of growth that I don't know about, but are there things that I do know about that I'm not willing to tend to, right? But patients or their families directly or through satisfaction surveys raise concern about your attitude or the way you communicate with them. Okay? Doesn't mean you're not a competent provider or a decent human being, but it does mean something. It means something too for these folks. We talked about it, things being systemic. Maybe that's not their experiences with you, perhaps not with your entire organization. but perhaps it is the case in other areas of their social life, including other ways in which they have interacted with health insurance companies or other providers, and so on and so forth. Right? It's important, and I don't mean to, this is just to remind us that oftentimes when we get into this work, we can overly rely on principles. Right? We can often interpret fairness as treating everyone the same. So some of this equality, equity stuff. We can think to ourselves that, well, what I do in my little part of the world is significant, and what's happening outside the world have to do with me. It can be helpful. It can certainly be daunting, right? When we turn on the world, right? Maybe we're not woke, but we're starting to have, as a colleague says, rapid eye movement. And now we are, engaging with the world in ways that we really didn't want to. And I recognize and respect that many of you have to do that every single day, given the work, the profession, the field, the realities that you're in. But it's important for us, hard as it is, to remind ourselves that context matters, that we do not live in a vacuum. We live in the world. And we may only be cognizant, explicitly cognizant of a part of it, right? But the ways in which the world interacts with us, are we tending to the ways in which we have explicit considerations, explicit biases via our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors around certain folks, certain identities, certain communities? And in a related sense, even if you are fine and you're good and you're so woke that you know that you're not supposed to say that you're woke, that's how woke you are. But it doesn't take away from the context that many of our clients, many of our colleagues, many of folks in our communities have to navigate a world where context matters, and they may be dealing with other folks, other institutions, other ideologies that have different things to say. So they may be navigating iterations of explicit bias, right? For example, and I had a number, I want to be frank, I had a number of other images up here, right? Now, we might all look at the Nazi flag that's up here and say that's an iteration of explicit bias. That's not okay, right? And just in case it needs to be said, if you are okay or want to approach a both sides argument for Nazism or white supremacy, perhaps your field, your profession is not for you, right? Just a loving reminder. But there may be other things that we are less aware of. We don't think of because we haven't had to think about them, right? So the image on the top right, the person who's checked off is a good fit, right? They don't have to think about their identities. Now, they may be aware of those things. But in many cases, those of us who hold any idea of privilege, right? And we can be privileged and marginalized at the same time, right? We may or may not be aware of things. And so this is important when we reckon with what does it mean to hold implicit bias or explicit bias, implicit for whom or explicit for whom. We may all see a Nazi flag and feel some kind of way about it, and we notice it, right? We may not recognize that there may be other flags that send a message to people, right? Even the American flag, right? And if you are a person in this country where the country hasn't been good to you or done some things to you, you're going to feel a different kind of way about that. There may be subtle things that occur. So part of why I have a television here, part of why the civil rights movement in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s did what it did is because of the advent of television, right? So folks could see fire hoses and dogs and all of these things, right? And go, oh, okay, that's some visceral stuff happening here, right? But what if you were to watch mall security footage and someone who holds explicit biases, and maybe it's reinforced by store policy, following certain kinds of folk around, right? Now, folks that perhaps have experienced that or know folks that have are more likely to see that for what it is, even though it might be more subtle or unconscious for some of us. So part of why it's important to reckon with this is to think about that what may be implicit for you might be explicit for others. How do we make space for other folks that have had different sets of experiences? Even when the possibility that those experiences exist go against what we would like to think the world is. And I imagine that many of us in a profession such as mental health and addiction have to reckon with this every single day. But it lends itself to these questions like, who do we believe? What do we believe? Who do we deny, or what do we deny? When we saw images of Derek Chauvin, right, kneeling on the neck of George Floyd, did we rationalize that? Did we make sense of that? And if so, wherever you stand on those issues, right, were you honest with yourself? I believe this happened and here's why. That means something. I'd imagine this last year has been a particularly challenge to the field of mental health and addiction in light of COVID-19. And here's I'm going to pivot this into why things that might not be seem to be directly correlated with our work matters. We can certainly think about the disproportionate impact on trauma and mental health that has impacted all of us. It is disproportionately and exponentially true for certain communities who have been scapegoated or blamed or dehumaned, right? So, for example, in the last year, there has been a marked increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans. Right? Language matters. Calling something the China flu or the Wuhan virus, Kung flu, right? I like a pun as good as the next dad, but that did some things that aren't so great. There has been a 169% increase. And hate against Asian Americans or folks that are perceived to be Asian Americans is not a new phenomenon, but the increase is quite substantial. Largely with verbal harassment, shunning, physical assault, right? Folks being coughed or spat on. There's also workplace discrimination or refusal of service. And maybe you have a policy and more importantly, a practice in your place of work that is not going to be tolerated here, right? And perhaps you've got strong enough policy and leadership that if explicit biases were to manifest, folks are not going to keep their jobs. You may not be able to get a job. That's how determined you're going to be, right? Sometimes organizations will enact policy, procedures, practices because it's the right thing to do. Sometimes there's just the business case. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. But even if your organization is not susceptible, not prone to doing these kinds of things, it's also important to remind ourselves. And I'm just using this particular population group as an example. Like folks have to experience this outside. And so it's important when we think about explicit bias, it's not just the explicit biases that we may hold, but oftentimes our folks are walking through a minefield just to get to your office, right? You know, to tie this to stereotypes, for example, right? An awful stereotype about some Asian Americans is that they are not good drivers. So I grew up in New York, and so I drive a little too fast for my my wife's liking, right? And I can mess up and forget my turn signal and those kinds of things sometimes, right? But I get to do that as an individual, right? So even on the way to your office, or maybe perhaps they're making a phone call with you, perhaps there's some other things that other folks have had to navigate that are not your fault, beyond your sphere of influence, but are still real, are still significant, still meaningful, and can certainly impact the ways in which they are engaging with you, right? So what do we do with that? So some strategies. Some of the good news about explicit bias is because they are the result of deliberate thought, they can be consciously regulated. And we can do that ourselves. And I would encourage you, if you have explicit biases, to not say like, I'm not going to do that anymore. I love Muslims now. Like that's not how it works, right? This is not the Matrix where you put a chip in and then you're woke now, or you shed your biases. But it is important to name and know them, and then ask yourself, am I willing to do this and why? It's also important to know that people can be more motivated to control their biases, that there are social norms in place which dictate that prejudice is not socially acceptable. There are going to be times where you, for your colleagues, for your supervisors, for other folks related to your profession, may not shift their attitudes. And yet, if there is a culture, and this is where the cultural aspect of doing the work, what kind of culture does your organization have with respect to concerns of diversity, equity, inclusion, justice? To let folks know, you better keep that to yourself. And maybe that is not going to change attitude, and that can still cause concern, that can still be problematic. At the very least, by creating conditions and social norms in your workspace, not because things are politically correct, but because it is the correct thing to do, you at the very least will interrupt untoward behaviors, right? And if that the culture of social norms that are about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice are real, then you will look at existing policies, right? You'll look at your hiring practices. You'll look at your intake, and when somebody says, well, we can't really translate this into another language because we don't have the means to do that, we might take another look. So some things to think about, right? What things that we can do, and again, here's why it's important to name that this is not just what's happening in our workplace. We are socialized really from before we're born. Before my son knew what singing was, he knew that his father, before he knew what a father was, did not have a good singing voice. Because I used to sing to him when he was in the womb, right? Right? He was, he'd kick away at the belly, and now I think it was to say, please stop doing that. But we make sense of the world before we're even born. And so what does that mean? We can't undo all that's been done. But are we willing, as Dr. Maya Angelou says, face with courage what we've done so we don't do it again? I am paraphrasing, right? What does it mean? And it is not agree to disagree language, but that we want to listen to understand. We generally want to inquire, but recognize that sometimes our seeking to learn about other groups should not come at the expense of those groups. If you won't teach me, how will I learn kind of stuff, right? Respect, literally taking another look at something. We're willing to have these hard conversations with our kids, with ourselves, right? This is a really important one, similarities and differences. So seeing a shared fate can be great, right? Sometimes there's a language in an office space that we're all family here, right? Some of you may be rolling your eyes when I said that, right? Because we know that it's only true if it's true, right? It's really important that we can understand a common group identity, but also that doesn't mean it's the expense of our differences. This can be iterations of race-evasive language, for example, or not, recognizing that certain folks are disabled, or may not have access to the same bathroom space you do, right? So we need to embrace and respect, not just tolerate differences, but embrace and respect them. So can there be a both and, right? Anyone who is in a committed relationship might recognize that distinction. My wife and I have quite a bit in common, but we're a little different, right? can we extend that and recognize when we don't? So recognizing the both and approach to our similarities and differences and applying that principle to our practices and being mindful, being explicit in our iterations of if we're doing that and when we're not is exceptionally powerful. That's the work, right? And then intergroup contact and context. For a number of reasons, we have been stratified from one another. We have, we are physically separated in so many ways, and we just inherited a bit of a mess. So it's good to have intergroup contact that can reduce prejudice, deepen understandings of one another, but it also has to be mitigated because there are power differences that can take place, right? Just putting me in a room with women, for example, can perhaps facilitate my understanding on being respectful and equitable of how oftentimes women's voices are shot over or not believed, or I can take credit for something that they've said, right? But if I am not mindful of that, and even if I am mindful of that and don't really care, if I don't have other folks holding me accountable or facilitating that those interactions are productive and not at their expense for my learning, right? Sometimes intergroup contact can go wrong, right? So increasing trust and reducing the anxiety requires, and I hope you've noticed there's a theme here, that our leadership needs to set the stage here, right? And not by letting everyone know what a good person they are, but willing to lead with humility, right? So when you're engaging with different communities, if you're doing outreach, if you're revising your job descriptions, right? If you recognize that there's historical mistrust with a certain community in your community that is underserved, right? Just hanging out together is not going to resolve it on their own. There has to be a deliberate emphasis to be mindful of those dynamics, including the dynamics of power. Okay? Some other things to think about. The impetus to question or challenge one's conscious biases may be impelled from an external source, right? So sometimes it's not about you doing the work. Sometimes, like somebody might say, hey, Dennis, I've noticed that the ways in which you treat your indigenous colleagues, you're kind of talking down on them a little bit. Oh, okay. Yeah, I know. Maybe they're not civilized, is what I might say, right? And I know that seems like a bit hyperbolic, but I recently had to interact with a situation where somebody actually said that, right? With me. But it happened. At the end of the day, if you are voluntold, if you come kicking and screaming, if you just have to interrupt your behaviors but are not changing your attitudes and beliefs, at the end of the day, it requires that we are internally motivated to confront our explicit biases and our willingness to take deliberate actions to change. Related to that, sometimes folks will use the language of implicit bias when we know. Right? Oh, I had no idea what I was doing. Right? So if you find yourself doing that, and there's a good chance that maybe you didn't know, but at the end of the day, are you being honest? Are we being honest? I mentioned, and I'm going to close before I open up to questions, the work of Paul Gorski, who focuses on education, and there's a link here. And again, this is really geared through K-12 education, but I do think the language is really helpful. Just thinking about some things that we can do. So he's got his 5 sort of abilities for equity literacy. So one, that we recognize even the subtlest biases, inequities in oppressive ideologies. Respond in the short term to biases, inequities, and oppressive ideologies. Redress long-term biases, inequities, and oppressive ideologies. What are the root causes of this? Right? You can't transform your organization or the society or yourself overnight. But are we willing to do that work? Right? And then what does it mean to not just reactively, but to actively cultivate ideologies and an institutional work culture that is both equitable and anti-oppressive? Mindful of these power dynamics, mindful of the ways in which we heretofore and currently might exhibit explicit biases. And how do we sustain this, right? Bias-free, if that's even possible, equitable and an anti-oppressive workplace, communities, ideologies, and institutional cultures, right? I recognize that this can be overwhelming and there's a lot going on here. And there's some good language that you may be able to adapt from this equity literacy framework to give you some ideas about some things that you might actually do, some real tangible work steps. But I do want to honor your time, and I will open things up for questions. And I appreciate you, even if you would silently chuckle at the pun under my questions. You don't have to, just be honest.
Dr. Rudnick, thank you so much. Just some excellent questions that have poured in. I'd like to revisit one of your slides, the categories in the early beginning slides. Yes, that one, thank you.
Okay, sure.
The first question is specific to, could you comment about political affiliation here as its own category?
Absolutely. Right, so there's one distinction here about hidden identity or invisible identity, right? One may not be able to interpret what one's political identity is or affiliation. And this can be quite challenging, particularly if you feel like you're not being heard or you are being put into a box because of reviews, right? I may have explicit biases about folks that are in a different end of the ideological spectrum than I do. It's a great question and it's an important one. I think what we have to do is recognize that we have that, recognize that all of these things matter, but they don't all matter in the same kinds of ways. So I don't want to detract from your question, but for example, I am ethnically Jewish. You wouldn't know that unless I told you, right? So the ways in which I experience my Jewishness are still valid, but it's not the same thing if in the ways that I experience things based upon my biological sex or my perceived or real racial identity. So it's one important consideration that I think we have to think about. Now, in doing this work, there can often be an assumption that one's political affiliation inhibits one from doing the work, right? What I ask, what can be helpful, is that wherever you stand on a political or ideological spectrum, is that you see an opportunity, what you can control within your own sphere of influence, and think about, am I looking at the same sources all the time, right? And it doesn't mean that every source is valid, right? I'll be frank, if you're getting your news from Newsmax or QAnon, I want to strongly suggest you look elsewhere, right? That's my bias. Am I being explicit with it, right? Not everything is reduced to opinion, but it's important for all of us to recognize that we do hold biases about something, and whatever something is, wherever we stand on something, I think we need to recognize that. Political affiliation does have a place in this work because it's one of the ways in which we make sense of the world and ourselves. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Dr. Rudnick. I think it was so important that you identified the physicality of visual observation versus the invisible identities. And I think so much has been brought to the forefront in these recent months that it's important to name that. In segue, in response to naming, I want to thank the next question, the asker of the next question, for the level of vulnerability in asking this question. Our attendee asks, as a Black man, I have experienced subtle bias, and this is prevalent in many workplaces that I have been employed at. Is that a thing? Is subtle bias a thing?
That is such a powerful question in a number of ways, and I want to echo what Sunny said empathetically. That when folks share their truth, when they speak truth to power, they have the audacity to speak their truth, knowing in many cases they're not going to be believed, or they're going to be told that they're being too sensitive, they're going to be refuted, rebuked, diluted, so on and so forth. Maybe you let them know that you're one of the good ones and it's okay. When folks know all of those possibilities and they still speak their truth, even in a space like this, do we not have the audacity to listen to what they have to say, even if we don't want to believe them? What would it mean if we believed folks when they shared those truths? And I think at the essence of the question and the point, right, it might be subtle for some, but not for others, when you have to experience certain phenomena all the time, right? The work of microaggressions makes this very clear. There's a great video called Why Microaggressions Are Like Mosquito Bites. I believe I may have used it in an earlier workshop, maybe a year or two ago through TechServe and DMHA. I don't recall offhand, but it is a really powerful one. And they're patterns. It's when things happen all the time. And even if things are subtle on a case-by-case basis, they pretty quickly don't become so, right? So eye movement, moving away, right? Our body language with one another, right? They might be subtle to the unobserved or unexperienced eye, but for other folks it is quite explicit, right? So again, how do we honor that even if something is implicit to us, that may not be the experience of other folks? I hope I've honored your question.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rudnick. I feel we almost need a moment to continue to ponder that particular question in the context of being able to name it, as you said, that is a microaggression, and that almost in asking the question, the individual is almost asking for permission of, is this really a thing? Or maybe the more underlying question is, should I even be sensitive to this? And the response is absolutely, because this is what you are dealing with on a day-to-day, and this is the impact to your work and the impact to your mental health and how you show up. And so I highly encourage the individual to reach out for additional any resources and any support that we may be able to offer.
Yeah, can I add to that? Thank you. Can I add to, in my previous role at IUPUI, a lot of what I encountered, even though it wasn't part of my official job description, was supporting students that were victims of various degrees of harassment, discrimination. Sometimes it was, sexual harassment, those kinds of things, where a lot of times students would struggle with and often attempt to internalize, is like, well, maybe I'm overthinking it, right? They were being stalked, for example. Like, well, I didn't get sexually assaulted, so that's okay. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. Or they said they meant what they said as a joke, so I guess it's okay, right? When we don't confront that, we internalize it, right? And that's true for those of us that are on the receiving end. It's also true for those of us that are on the providing end of those things. When we don't reckon or reconcile with the ways in which our biases and our behaviors cause harm to other folks, we are normalizing and we are internalizing certain patterns that are quite unhealthy to us as well. So I just think it's important to name all of that. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Rudnick. I know we are at 11:30, but we have two additional questions that I really want to make sure that we address with having Dr. Rudnick available today. Do you have resources on unpacking biases based on trauma? For an example, someone in the LGBTQIA community's trauma at the hands of the faith community.
That's a great question. I'm trying to reconcile with, I know that there are some good resources out there, and I will get those out to folks. I am at a loss for thinking for a specific resource. I do know that there are tons of organizations out there, including ones specifically for the LGBTQ+ community that have to often reconcile their faith, right? And one of the challenges can be some folks could be strongly in their faith and are told not only are they not fully human or something wrong or deviant or sinful with them because of who they are, not how they choose to be, not what their preferences are, but who they are, but they're also not allowed to be a person of faith, right? And so this came up in my class a little bit, like there's that one particular passage where I had another student who was like, I'm devoted, I am a full-on Christian, and actually that passage is talking about pedophilia, right? So there's a lot of misinformation and misconstruing about things too. And that doesn't mean that if you are on the other side of things with your faith, that your faith is necessarily wrong. You're wrong for holding a faith. So I know I'm not answering the question, but I just want to take the opportunity to contextualize that. And I will probably, as soon as I'm done with our time here today, be reminded of a specific resource that I will be happy to share with folks. And I apologize for not having that at the ready.
Dr. Rudnick, we'll certainly follow up with you on that specific resource, and we'll post it in the follow-up to the all conference. And thank you again for the attendee for asking for those resources.
Mm-hmm.
As the audience thinks of additional areas of need and resourcing support, please do let us know. You can either provide it in the question pane or directly email us at info@techserve.io. We are happy to follow up on those resource dissemination and needs. The last question that we're going to pose today, Dr. Rudnick, is in your example, or rather in your discussion of the intergroup contact, could you give an example of a positive intergroup contact in context and how our mental health and addictions providers could begin using that almost as a tactical approach to addressing explicit bias?
I love that question. And I'm going to try to be succinct so I don't spend 5 hours and bleed into Dr. D'Angelo's talk, which I really want to encourage you all to stick around for. So perhaps you are working with or seek that there is a disproportionality of your veteran population in your community that are homeless, but have also sought out pain medication to deal with PTSD. Your veteran status or lack thereof is whatever your veteran identity is going to impact how they perceive you, how they trust you, right? So an approach to take in there is not this, and I'm trying to speak broadly, but also concretely, because that's the question that was asked, because I want it to be applicable to other areas. At the heart of it is not it's not necessarily what you do, it's how you do it and why you do it the way that you do. There is something along the lines of what would be called a deficit orientation that definitely is present in education, in healthcare, in clergy, oftentimes in philanthropy work, and oftentimes in helping or service professions. And so if we come in with the lens that I just need to help or save or civilize this folk, that it is up to them solely to have some personal individual accountability, and not understanding their context, even though you don't have to have lived through a theater of war, right, to fully understand it, but at least understand that you don't understand it. And I think your dispositions, your body language, your humility in those interactions will make marked differences, not just in their capacity to get healthier, right, but in their motivation to do so with you, because there's been some trust established. And so a mechanism of not coming in, devolving yourself of all of who you are, but really thinking about what is going on in our frames of interaction, right? What assumptions are we having about, I think, certain group or community members? And recognizing this is imperative that things take time. I have a good former friend of mine, that a white guy that worked in an indigenous community school, and as progressive as he was in his thinking and understanding of culture and respect for culture, he was not trusted, at least not initially. And it took some work to realize that it wasn't who he was as an individual, but how his identity showed up. And there needed to be patience and time. Anyone who's a fan of Shawshank Redemption knows what I mean by patience and time, right? So ultimately, he developed quite a healthy relationship, not just with the students, but by their parents, the elders in the community, the other leadership in the school, because he recognized and accepted and didn't spend the entire time trying to apologize for who he was. He showed that he was willing to understand where they were coming from. And so if we are willing to immerse ourselves in the work with communities and not just show up when it is politically or personally expedient, that is the cultural work where it can yield quite positive results. So that I hope that gives some language and just some things to think about, because if you're doing it right, there's a good chance in the beginning that you are not going to be received well, because there's a history, there's a miasma of mistrust that we need to swim through.
Dr. Rudnick, thank you so much for not only your clear exploration of explicit bias, but supporting our ability to individually address how we recognize explicit bias within ourselves and how to appropriately respond through the tactical applications and recommended self-reflection questions that you've posed. We are grateful for your conference primer, as the Cultural Competency Enhancement Project is about the ability to appropriately have tough conversations. And I think that's an excellent segue to our upcoming keynote speaker with Dr. Robin DiAngelo.